All right, excellent. Oh, there we go. I will not leave the meeting. That would be bad form. Okay, so per the outline, we're going to spend some time this morning talking through kind of the state of research in career and technical education, largely to date. There are some things in the past year that have come out that maybe haven't been fully incorporated, but I don't think any sort of sea changes in the overall research environment as pertains to CTE research. And so the general plan will be to kind of cover these 5 big categories about sort of what we know in broad strokes and how confident we are in what we know, thinking about causality and the ability to make causal inference at the center of that. We'll highlight the sort of fundamental challenges of why there isn't more causal research more than 20 years into the sort of causal method revolution in social science. We'll talk about some of the descriptive evidence. We'll talk about the causal evidence, and then we'll highlight some salient issues for future and further research. This will be sort of that last section, a set of ideas I have and that we've collectively developed as a result or based on sort of what I laid out yesterday morning, and then kind of the state of the research as it stands that we'll go through today. So as with yesterday, please feel free to jump in as you have questions or comments that you'd like to include. I am going to try to maintain the chat in my screen. So I will look for your comments if you post them there, but do feel free to unmute and jump in as you can. As I mentioned, I can only see a handful of thumbnails for the pictures. So if you're it's just more difficult for me to gauge if there's visual evidence. So please don't be shy. Visual evidence of questions, I should say. All right. So you know, the general state of research suggests that you know, employment and earnings outcomes are better for students who concentrate in CTE in high school or who complete certificates in college. So the sorts of industry recognized credentials or certificates that we discussed yesterday. And so you can think big picture finding number one, students who have specific skills gained through technical education programs get paid more and are more likely to have a job at the end of the completion compared to otherwise similar students who did not get that training. The impact on academic outcomes as opposed to employment outcomes has been ambiguous. The focus has mainly been on test scores and grades. You know, it's not entirely clear that the purpose of technical education is necessarily to improve math and reading test scores. Certainly it's not the mandate that the instructors get, nor I would say the explicit policy focus, but there's some reason to believe perhaps that if students are more engaged in learning process, that they may learn more across all subject areas, and that could show up in test scores. Another set of theories would posit that there could be some sort of complementarity between learning in technical spaces and in the sort of core academic spaces if applied learning helps reinforce or introduce principles that are tested on the math and reading side. And that grades, we know through quite a bit of research, reflect both effort and understanding. And so if effort is a proxy for engagement, we might expect grades to be higher. But to be clear, the evidence to date is ambiguous there. Attainment of a high school diploma, so actually graduating from high school, we have some evidence now across a number of contexts that graduation outcomes can be enhanced by attending a specialized CTE high school of the form that I mentioned yesterday, and the types of ways students in high school can engage in CTE. But the college going impact is less clear. And I mentioned yesterday that there seems to be some growing evidence that there are higher rates of enrollment in two-year colleges on average across all CTE concentrations. But that 4-year college going is lower among CTE concentrators from high school. And so that's part of why this big picture finding is sort of ambiguous, since the direction, the sign of these two different potential post-secondary education paths go in opposite directions. I'd say another finding that's sort of an open question is that we don't know whether what you study in CTE in high school, if you do study CTE in high school, is necessarily aligned with your later experiences. It's not entirely clear that it should, or that that's the intended theory of action in all instances. But there has been a little bit of research that has tried to unpack whether what you study as a 14 to 18-year-old in high school is a predictor of what you do later on. So that's sort of the broad state of the literature, and we'll dig in greater detail across the rest of this session. So first, the big challenges. You might ask yourself, if the causal research revolution in social science is more than 2 decades old, and if some of these methods have been around for even longer than that, why is it that we have not applied those methods to CTE more broadly? The main challenge is that students who select into taking CTE in high school or college are usually different, or we worry that they're different in important ways from the students who choose not to do that. Some of those differences we might observe, but the real challenge is that we probably don't observe important dimensions of difference, that if we were to just compare CTE participants and non-participants and not try to account for those unobserved differences, that we would end up with really biased estimates. So in general, the descriptive evidence, the non-causal evidence, we have to take with a grain of salt, because we understand that those estimates are likely biased. We just don't know kind of to what extent and by what factors specifically, but that's the big challenge. The second is, given that that's the case, why not randomly assign students in some sort of like nice experiment and get a better sense of how this should play out? I believe you did the Kemple 2008 reading for today, or the Kemple and Willner piece, evaluating the sort of medium-term impacts of career academies. Even still now, it's I think the only randomized controlled trial in a CTE setting that sort of can look at those post-high school outcomes. And in that instance, it was possible because there were more students who wanted to attend these career academies that then could be admitted. And so random assignment was possible in ways that are analogous to literature on charter school lotteries and the impacts of attending a charter school. But generally, it doesn't make sense in CTE to randomly assign students, because if someone's not interested in CTE, it's not clear that we should, well, I'd say it is pretty clear that it would be, we might consider it unethical to make that sort of random assignment. Now, conditional on interest, that would be different, but there haven't been many opportunities for that. We'll talk about the opportunities that sort of approximate that, but lend themselves to a different research design because of the way students are admitted. And then the third point, I've sort of presaged this here, that even if we can observe many characteristics of students, even in the best administrative data, we really worry about the unobservable characteristics that could be biasing estimates from observational data or non-causal studies. In particular, student motivation, their knowledge of industries, their family work history, other kind of sociocultural contexts that might inform their interest in pursuing CTE, that if we did not observe it, would likely bias our estimates. And then finally, a challenge that hasn't been fully taken on in the existing CTE literature, though is being taken on to some extent in ongoing research, is the fact that when we define the treatment of CTE, and I know Steve Ross talked with you all yesterday about counterfactuals, right? Knowing what defines the CTE treatment and what defines the counterfactual or sort of control condition is important for also interpreting any sort of effect or lack thereof. And so often we define the treatment as being a concentrator or the number of courses a student has taken, but we don't really pin down the counterfactual. And so that's another persistent challenge in CTE research. Although in the paper that you read yesterday for Steve's session, they sort of are the first to take that on in a systematic way to think about versions of counterfactuals. So I'll say some more about that in just a second, but just want to pause for a moment to see if there are questions. It is, after all, earlier for those on the West Coast and those of us in the Mountain West.
Oops.
Go ahead.
Okay, so I was wondering just about how do you try to account for things like motivation, knowledge of industries, family work history in kind of your own research?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the studies that I've done, I've been able to use regression discontinuity designs where essentially we've had schools there are more applicants than the schools can accommodate. And so one version of how you might admit students there would be to randomly assign them. The schools, though, in Connecticut and Massachusetts, where I've done this, have instead adopted a process where students submit application materials and then they get scores on those application materials and then are ranked in descending order and admitted from the highest scoring until they run out of seats, essentially. And so that lends itself to a regression discontinuity design. But to answer your question, like right near the cutoff where students stop being admitted because the school has run out of room, we know two things. One, every student in the sample has applied to that school intentionally, and so we think are likely similar on their motivation and knowledge of industries. And two, the score that they received on their application materials are also nearly identical. And so in those instances, we think the application score is identical or nearly identical, and they've clearly have some shared motivation. Now, I don't know specifically if you, Victor, and I have the exact same underlying motivation. So we are still making a bit of a leap of faith there, but the same applies in a randomized control trial too. We have to show balance on observable characteristics between the treatment group and the control group when we randomize people. And as long as we have balance on things we can observe, we make the assumption that on average, the unobserved characteristics should also be balanced. And the same applies in these regression discontinuity designs or something analogous, given that there's like a ranking score that leads to admission. But kind of net of that, you'd have to probably try to introduce some other measure as an observable characteristic, which one certainly could if you could administer like a psychological battery or some other scale would be another way of showing that. Hongwook, did you also have a question?
Yeah, I was going to ask about the first and second point. So because of this, definitely we will have a different characteristic of students who took the CTE or concentrator. So I'm just wondering whether there's a certain research about who actually are going to be CTE takers or concentrators. Yeah, those kind of studies.
Sure. So I've got a working paper that's under review at the moment that takes this on to some extent, where we just try to use identifiable characteristics to predict who is interested in CTE or who goes on to be concentrators. So there is some descriptive work there that has done that. I don't know of work, though it may exist, because it could exist in a different space than I've been attending to. It could be more in like a educational psychology literature that focuses on maybe some of the like personality traits that are associated with going into CTE, but more of what I've been able to do with state administrative data has really just focused on, for instance, showing that students from families that are eligible for federally subsidized meals are more likely to select into CTE. Students who have lower test scores on average are more likely to select into CTE. Students with disabilities participate in higher rates in CTE, but there's also a lot of heterogeneity at the community level too. So not just students being eligible for subsidized meals, but if the community average earnings is lower, students are more likely. There's a larger share of students who are likely to be CTE concentrators.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Any other questions at this moment? Otherwise, we can jump into some of the details of thinking about the treatment control contrast. All right, so what we think about as CTE exposure or treatment in a sort of a classical experimental sense, depends on what we're comparing the experience to. So we both have to define in sort of a pretty complete way what a student did that we're calling CTE, what are the different dimensions of those experiences, so that we think that we have a solid handle on the entire treatment. But it's also important to think about the counterfactual or comparison condition in order to get a strong handle on the CTE experience. Just by way of example, if getting into a specialized CTE school gets you a set of experiences that we could define in ways like I did yesterday, where you have, let's say, the opportunity to explore different programs, you have a stable set of cohort mates from grades 10 through 12, and a stable set of instructors across multiple years, and you take a greater number of your elective course credits in CTE, those are certain dimensions of the CTE experience. In contrast, we need to know, if you didn't get into that specialized school, are you still taking CTE courses at your comprehensive high school? Or did you get into a different specialized CTE school? Or is the school, your comprehensive high school, offering you lots of work-based learning experiences without knowing the kind of dimensions of defining these two different settings? We have to make some intellectual leaps that might be incorrect and would lead us to interpreting the estimates from our models in ways that maybe aren't entirely right. So let's start by thinking of the ways that we could define CTE exposure. I mean, the thing that's most common in the research that uses nationally representative data for descriptive research is to use the number of courses a student has taken in CTE, or the number of credits, which is sort of a de facto way of defining what proportion of a student's academic experience in high school can be accounted for by CTE coursework. Another definition of CTE exposure that I've used in my own research is being admitted to a whole school model of CTE, whether it's in Massachusetts or Connecticut, or there's work that I'll highlight that's getting admitted to a career academy, like in the Kemple work that you read. And then we would have to define what it means to have gotten into that school, but also need to define what was experienced by the people who did not get into that school. Another dimension we could consider is sort of whether or not the technical and sort of non-technical coursework is formally integrated in the CTE setting, whether or not there's these multi-year mentorship or cohort-based models, and the extent to which and what is included in a set of work-based learning experiences. So yesterday when we were talking about defining different dimensions of the CTE experience, not on this list, but certainly relevant, and I'll highlight later, are the role of career and technical student organizations, as well as partnerships with employers and or post-secondary educational settings, internship programs, things of that nature. But all of these different things, and we'll go through in more detail, we need to have considered as potential dimensions of the CTE experience, so we know what we're defining as the treatment, and then similarly trying to identify the presence or absence of these factors in the counterfactual or control or comparison settings, so that we know what the contrast is between those two. Oh, Hanuk, is there a whole slide that I had forgotten about on your question here? So in my prior work in Massachusetts, we did show that lower income students are sort of historically overrepresented, as are students with disabilities in CTE settings. We've replicated the finding about students from lower income families in Connecticut that held true for students with disabilities in the specialized CTE schools. There is not disproportionate representation. It appears to be about the same as the incidence of students with disabilities among the general high school population. And Matt Gianni's work in Texas shows some variation there across state contexts. So this is certainly something to attend to. There are some clear racial and ethnic disparities in representation in some fields, in particular across STEM fields, and in the Dougherty and McDonald 2020 piece that's referenced under bullet point 1A. We get into this to some extent that if we might see sort of average differences in enrollment in different programs. And then when we control for test scores, we see some even larger disparities. Some more recent work that is as yet unpublished, but will be forthcoming through the CTE Policy Exchange. We show that some of the differences in what programs students participate in is a function of what programs are offered at their school. So some of the sort of sorting into schools or residential sorting or residential segregation accounts for some of the differences in participation because there's simply different programs being offered. We see some clear gender disparities by program of study and cluster. There's a working paper that I'm happy to share. It's currently under review, but where we just see massive differences in the likelihood of students concentrating in particular programs of study by gender, though quite honestly, you don't need to look at the research so much to be convinced of that. You can look at the national statistics through NCES and see that this is quite clear. And then even as I mentioned at the community level, there's some difference in sort of based on average community income or community earnings that account for some of the differences in CTE participation, and that's likely related to socioeconomic status and sort of working class distinctions in the value of CTE. So with that as context, we'll sort of leap into what we know from the descriptive evidence. The descriptive evidence I'm using as just the headline for all of the non-causal studies, which is the bulk of the research on CTE, kind of leading up to the more recent years, where there's been an expansion of sort of the opportunities to capitalize on naturally occurring experiments. Most of the work in the descriptive research is sort of focused on the economics of education and sort of grows out of the theory that you know, education is an antecedent to work, and that skills accumulated through the educational process will get rewarded, whether they're general skills or specific skills. And so the idea is the specific skills that are being developed in CTE should pay off in terms of the form of higher probability of being employed and higher wages. So, you know, I've got an example here that if you know how to repair a car, for instance, you should get paid more and be more likely to be employed as an auto mechanic relative to someone else, maybe who was just trained on a job because, you know, there was someone needed to fill the position. You know, there's been less descriptive research about graduation outcomes or other educational attainment outcomes, in part because the theory does not suggest that attainment would be higher. In fact, sort of classic economic theory suggests that if students have more skills, they might be less likely to complete their high school diploma because they perceive that they can earn higher wages without that diploma that they don't need to necessarily stay and complete the diploma if they could get a job now with their current skills. Now, I think some of the norms around that have changed over the last 30 years, but that's, I mean, even just from a simple business cycle standpoint, we do see that when the economy is strong, dropout rates are higher, but when the economy is weak, dropout rates are lower, which is sort of consistent with that economic theory that when people's expected wages are lower, they're more likely to remain in school. That said, because of that learning outcomes have not been the focus for the most part in the descriptive evidence. But there is increased focus on special subpopulations, in part because it is more possible when you have larger studies and better statistical power and also, quite honestly, because there's this history of tracking in CTE that I mentioned yesterday. That folks have been able to look at differences by gender, race and ethnicity, disability status, dual language learners, and by programs of study, or at a minimum, sort of the cluster level, 16 big categories of CTE to look at different programs of study. In particular, work by Michael Gottfried and colleagues looking at applied STEM programs in CTE and how that relates to student outcomes. So just highlighting some notable studies here. We won't go through all of them, and in most instances, I've got these both the reference as well as the general focus of the papers. So the first paper here looks at CTE and dropout in a descriptive study. The Bishop in Maine looks at CTE types of broad categories of CTE and earnings. Same with the Newmark and Rothstein. The Kelly and Price look at CTE as a potential mechanism for engagement and reducing disengagement, as do the Planck, DeLuca, and Estacion. Stephanie Cellini's 2006 paper looked at tech prep programs and college going, and was one of the first studies to show kind of a positive association with two-year college enrollment among CTE concentrators or those that came through the tech prep program in the 90s. There's a Mir paper from 2007, also shows wage premiums to CTE participation, and some work on career academies that also shows favorable outcomes, and then this Kreisman and Stang paper that really starts to get into asking questions about what should be the optimal CTE policy, about who is recommended to take CTE and for whom it would pay off, and shows kind of persistent earnings premiums there among those who take more CTE. So I realize that's a sort of breakneck introduction. These are mainly here for your subsequent reference if you're interested, or have use for them, but it's meant to really emphasize that most of the work has been thinking about kind of employment and wage earnings outcomes, because that has been the hypothesized benefit of CTE historically. Though you can see there are a few studies here that do think about CTE and dropout or school engagement, and that's has been my own motivation for being interested in this as a teacher and administrator. I perceived that my students were more engaged. My students who attended the technical center part-time were more engaged in their comprehensive high school learning, and I perceived that part of that was because they knew they had to achieve a certain level of success and engagement at the comprehensive high school in order to get the benefit, the reward of getting to spend the rest of their day at the technical center. That, of course, was my own speculation, but this is just suggests that others have speculated similarly. And as I'll show you from the causal research, I think there's some evidence to suggest that speculation was not incorrect. So in the descriptive work, the different data sets have been used. We now have a more comprehensive list that our CTERN partners at Jobs for the Future have put together and is available through the CTERN website. So this is just a quick reference guide. Some of these national surveys. We also have a list that is less comprehensive than what is on the CTERN website in this Dougherty, Kamen, and Klein piece that I'll reference later this morning that focus on the different dimensions of how CTE experiences have been measured in the descriptive research, but also how they should be measured is the focus of that paper. Yeah, I think not much more to say here other than one thing that you maybe will notice is that a lot of the national surveys are older by definition. It takes some time for them to collect longitudinal data, but also it's been over 10 years now since a new longitudinal study. Though I think maybe there's one in early waves now that could start to be used. I'm blanking on the name of it, so feel free to interject if you know it, or that's a resource we could cobble together later.
I have a question.
Please.
So it seems like, so I recently actually looked at NLSY and ELSD datasets to see which kind of CTE variables we can use. And my impression is there's, of course, as you talked before, there's a lot of different variables. And I wonder if there's been any effort to try to use comprehensive sets of variables, for example, a number of CTE courses, which program of study you're specializing in, and then maybe like whether or not you're participating in vocational training, and then have there been any effort to combine them to look at different profiles, or some kind of composite sort that could reflect all these different things? Have there been any effort that you know of?
Not that I know of. So it certainly would be worth doing a 10 minutes of a library search and combined with Google Scholar to make sure that it's not showing up in a literature outside of what I would have been focused on. But to my knowledge, so there have been, and I'm a part of some studies that look at, differences in impacts for students with disabilities, students from lower income backgrounds. As I mentioned, there's a set of papers that focuses on sort of applied STEM CTE, but to my knowledge, there hasn't been work related to trying to develop typologies of students based on multiple measures, or let's say like sequences or combinations of courses that that would complement the sort of list of CTE courses as well. So I don't think so, I think is the short answer. But it certainly seems like a great idea for thinking about maybe how we might learn more dynamically about who's selected into CTE, or how different dimensions of CTE adjacent experiences, course taking could provide insight into CTE outcomes. Thanks, Suji. Any other questions?
Can you tell me do you know which states have like worthwhile longitudinal data systems that could be used for CTE research?
Sure. So this is, I'm glad that you asked this, because this has been a question that we've kind of kicked around internally. So states differ importantly in their interpretation of FERPA, the Federal Education Research. I'm going to trail off here because I'm forgetting what the letters mean on the spot, but their interpretation of FERPA, which is the education analog of HIPAA, which says that personally identifiable information has to be protected carefully for research use, and so some states, I mentioned that first because some states have excellent data sets, for instance, Florida, but my understanding is that the current interpretation of FERPA and research allowances don't allow for new research projects to be proposed to use those data. My best advice is if you find a research partner. So for instance, Kat is here from Maryland. Maryland has excellent data, and I know has, for my colleague Dara Zahandalar there, I think has been taking pains to really improve it. And from something that Kat mentioned yesterday, I think there's some intentionality about wanting to use it for research. Not to put you on the spot, Kat, or to suggest that Maryland can or would share their data, but I know they've made inroads. The state of Massachusetts data set is quite rich, and they're open to research partnerships. Connecticut has great data, but awesome. Thanks, Kat. I was pretty sure that there was a public data set, and I think actually, correct me if I'm wrong, that Maryland has been pretty innovative in trying to create a synthetic data set that mimics its actual data in ways that would allow for reduction of concerns about FERPA and personally identifiable information while still maintaining the underlying statistical properties of the data. But anyway, I digress. Let me highlight two examples. So Massachusetts and Connecticut have very similar data sets that include K-12 enrollment data, test taking, course taking, teacher information. They also can include links to the National School Clearinghouse data for post-secondary college enrollment for something like 95% of US-based post-secondary institutions. And they have links to the state unemployment insurance records, which means for people who are employed and in industries and employers that report unemployment insurance data, you can track them into the workforce. And so, I mean, that's a really powerful sort of pre-K through workforce data set. And they do broker research agreements based on with non-Massachusetts based partners like myself as part of their process. Now that's on sort of a case-by-case basis, but they do take sort of unsolicited proposals, though they've changed some of their rules around that recently. I'll just contrast that briefly so that I don't go on and on with the state of Connecticut, where their interpretation of FERPA is that any sort of state-specific data could only be shared with other state entities. So for instance, our research team works with the data all based in Connecticut by Connecticut-based researchers. I am still a de facto UConn visiting assistant professor, so I'm able to do that. But their interpretation of FERPA is quite different. So it's sort of on a state-by-state basis, but a lot of them now, because of investments made by IAS and the Federal Department of Education, have really rich longitudinal data systems. So yeah, depending on where you're located, I'd be happy to chat or try to help make connections if I know folks in those settings. And thanks, Kat, for adding this additional point in the chat about partner with a Maryland researcher is her understanding. That I think that's consistent with a lot of states now that do allow partnership research, is that having a state partner in that research is a prerequisite. Though for a long time, I don't know what the current state of play is, the North Carolina Research Center, I think it's a 6-letter acronym, did allow for applications to use their data by outside researchers. Any other questions? I'll try to keep the responses a little shorter. Gresham, thanks for this question. I have access to, yes, I'm currently using the P20 data in Tennessee to study the CTE teacher pipeline and ask questions about turnover. It does have an external data request for outside researchers, yes. So since I'm at a private institution, I'm not a state employee, and so, but we did have to go through our partnership with Tennessee Department of Education to help facilitate that approval. But because it was a TDOE approved project, we were able to get greenlit for that. It's actually, I think, easy to use, difficult to it takes some time to access it. Usually, if you're planning to do partnership work, it takes some time to develop relationships. It also then takes some time to get MOUs and data access in place. It's not just that latter part can easily take 6 months, and the relationship building part can take longer in my experience. For instance, it took me 5 years in Connecticut to broker the relationships that led to our ongoing work there. it was a little bit easier in Massachusetts, but I had graduate school advisors who helped pave the way there. So if you have connections or need connections, it's useful to try to capitalize on your networks to do that if that's of interest. All right, I will press on, but feel free, keep the questions coming, please. All right. So I've said some of this about how CTE has been measured in the past, so I won't overdo this too much, just to say that sort of counts of courses or credits, some broad focus areas, like the ones in the parenthetical statements there, whether or not a student is a concentrator compared to being a non-concentrator, doing some controlling for content area, these whole school models of CTE that I'll talk some more about. And then there's been an evaluation of the linked learning efforts in California that use some propensity score methods, but sort of kind of across most of the research, both descriptive and causal, this is how CTE has been defined sort of in broad strokes. And you'll notice the absence of sort of the other characteristics of the educational experience that are not listed here, and that could use some additional study. So with that in mind, here are some proposals in the 2020 paper that's listed at the bottom that we lay out. Doing a more detailed accounting of course taking or sequences of courses along the lines of some of what Sujin was suggesting. Looking at whole school admission, looking at program offerings in addition to participation. So attending to the supply side, you can't become an applied STEM concentrator if your school doesn't offer it. And so just being mindful of what is available is important. Thinking much more systematically about work-based learning, both for credit, for pay, and not for credit or not for pay. Experiences currently not collected systematically under Perkins or other federal legislation, but there's some increased efforts at the state level to capture this, though there isn't really a data infrastructure to do that in most instances. Looking at dual enrollment, college partnerships, articulation agreements, and thinking about indicators of connection to post-secondary life, measures of mentoring or connections, employer partnerships. These are all different ways that one might define the CTE experience. And also, these are all metrics that could be used to define the counterfactual or control condition so that we can then clarify the contrast. So inevitably, there are more things that could be measured here, but these are the sort of a set of more expansive conditions that are certainly relevant to the CTE sort of theory of action or theory of change that are likely not captured in most of the current research, but could be. So I know I paused just a second ago for questions. I'll just maybe do a shorter pause to make sure that there aren't things that we've been whipping past that you would like to ask about.
I have a very small question. I read one of your articles and I noticed you had CTE student organization listed also as that could be a measure. And how often, I never think that, they would have that a whole lot. How, often is it there? Is it utilized or?
So that's a great question. So thanks for raising that. I'm not sure why I did not put that on that slide, because I think we do, as you know, in the paper include CTSOs, and I certainly mentioned them yesterday. So one, I think, challenge is that there's not necessarily, schools can say that they have, so for instance, the Connecticut Technical High Schools list on their website which CTSOs exist at their schools. So to the extent that the website is up to date, we have some sense of what CTSOs are represented at the school, but we don't necessarily know individual student participation, right? And we're in the process of collecting some data from school leaders to get a sense of whether or not they have more than what's on the website, or different listings than what's actually on the website, but also whether or not they do any sort of systematic capturing of which students participate in those. Through a few conversations, school leaders have suggested that the teachers that are tasked with supervising those clubs or CTSOs know who participates, but that it doesn't go into some sort of like centralized administrative data warehouse in the way that other enrollment data does for sort of standardized reporting purposes. And so anyway, it's something that we don't really know about the full extent, or at least it hasn't been incorporated into the large scale quantitative research, but certainly could be used to maybe understand differences in outcomes. If, for instance, you, Sujin, were like in FFA as a agricultural concentrator, but I was also an ag concentrator and not in FFA, you know, we might think about that as a potentially meaningful difference in our engagement or exposure that could explain differences in our outcomes. So yeah, it's simply just not systematically recorded in the quantitative data, but certainly a relevant consideration.
Thank you.
Absolutely. All right, well, continue please to jump in with questions, but we'll press on to starting to unpack the causal evidence. There are not a ton of studies, but because the focus of this training is on understanding how to perform research using causal methods, but also to understand why it's important, we'll take a little more care in unpacking a handful of these studies to really understand a bit more about what's being studied and how it's studied. So as I mentioned, it's not a large pool of research. It's at this point all capitalizing on naturally occurring experiments in part because there have not been large-scale opportunities for randomizing students to kind of treatment and control conditions. You know, the opportunities for large-scale policy change, like funding changes or changes in program offering, aren't necessarily happening with a high frequency or on a scale that has allowed that to occur. But there have been kind of more recent instances based on the growing popularity of CTE of excess demand leading to these lottery-like admissions that I described before, and I'll explain in a little more detail in a few minutes the application of these regression discontinuity designs. All of this sort of causal evidence is able to focus on sort of high school-based experiences through the completion of high school and maybe up to not quite a decade at this point of post-high school experiment or post-high school experience. That's just a limitation of the data sets so far. We just haven't observed people further into the future, or for cohorts that we may have observed earlier, we don't have the outcome data. It just wasn't being collected yet in the data sets that exist. So there's just a few examples of studies that can look at longer term outcomes, and they're all currently in international context. So the Bertrand et al. Piece looks at a Reform 94. So it was basically a policy change in Norway that changed high school graduation requirements and impacted CTE. And so for folks who are in their 40s like me and experience that change, if they were in Norway, they can see some of those outcomes into middle age. There's this Hanishek et al. Piece in the Journal of Human Resources that can look at sort of the whole arc of earnings using international data. The sort of trade-off, I would say, with that study being the only one where we can really see the long-term outcomes is that the long-term outcomes for programs that existed 40 years ago, and to some extent, there's a challenge in trying to understand whether or not we think that the sort of economic benefits or returns to CTE from programs 40 years ago, whether or not we think that those should be sort of what we would expect today, but it's the best available evidence. And then this Silliman and Vertanen paper, I'm citing the working paper here, but it's forthcoming now, I think in 2021, they use oversubscribed schools in Finland and can see into individuals in their 30s. So really the limits on what we know are a function of the data sets to a large extent, and the timing of when these either oversubscribed schools or policy changes have occurred. So some notable causal studies, most of which we'll unpack at least a little bit. The Kemple and Willner Career Academy RCT from MDRC, the Lindsay Page's 2012 follow-up, where she used causal mediation to understand essentially that the impacts of the career academies from the Kemple and Willner study on earnings, like up to 7 years after high school, all of the benefits, all of the positive impacts were accrued to boys, and were largely mediated by the extent to which they had applied learning or work-based learning experiences in those career academies, which I mean, really to date still gives us the sort of best insight into how this works. My regression discontinuity study for Massachusetts on a handful of CTE schools, and then trying to generalize to a broader set using OLS methods. The Helmut, Leonard, and Paplow is oversubscribed. Career Academy in North Carolina, the Silliman and Vertanen I just mentioned, Bertrand, Mogstad, and Montjoy paper looking at Reform 94 in Norway. Chardet Bonilla's 2020 paper where she looked at a sort of a policy incentive in California that competitively awarded grants to schools to expand their applied CTE learning opportunities, and then she used awarding of those grants to see how the subsequent programming change impacted student outcomes. And then this Brunner, Dougherty, and Ross paper where we look at the sort of impacts through age 25 of getting into oversubscribed schools in Connecticut. So I'll have a little more to say about each of these in a moment. There arguably are a few other papers. These are all sort of K-12 oriented papers. I mentioned yesterday some work by Michelle Gross and Riley Acton that look at some impacts on post-secondary outcomes and participation in community colleges, returns to certificates. There are some other studies too that look at returns to community college certificates that I can't remember quite honestly at the moment if I enumerate those later in this slide deck, but I should and will put them together and share with you all before the end of the week. Okay, so now I'll sort of enumerate each of these studies in slightly more detail. They're bulleted out in ways that are sort of similar layout across studies. So hopefully it's easier to follow along and hopefully can be a useful reference point in the future. So the Kemple and Willner study is a randomized controlled trial of students being randomly assigned to 9 different career academies. The career academies were oversubscribed, which is why the random assignment was permitted. In this instance, we can think about the treatment as being the whole school model of getting into this career academy, where the counterfactual, as far as we know, is getting into a comprehensive high school that does not offer the career academy model. And they sort of, well, not sort of, they find equivocal results in high school graduation and learning outcomes, though they do point out in the paper that the sort of counterfactual outcomes, the learning outcomes were quite high among students who were not admitted. So the potential to detect an effect, if one existed, was lessened in part because sort of students who didn't get into the career academies already had pretty good outcomes. But they did find positive impacts on employment and earnings 7 years after high school, though as I mentioned a moment ago, those impacts were all for boys and were moderated by exposure to work-based learning, as highlighted in the page 2012 causal mediation follow-up. So in my 2018 paper, I was sort of the first entree into trying to study oversubscribed CTE dedicated high schools, regional vocational and technical schools in Massachusetts. I also used OLS regression to control for the factors that I know were used in the admissions process, so that we could compare students on the characteristics used to admit them, to sort of improve the generalizability. But as I mentioned, based on a question earlier, I used a regression discontinuity design in that paper, which is similar to what we use in Connecticut and similar to what Silliman and Vertanen use. Because there's competitive admission to these schools, students are ranked on this admission score, which is comprised of like prior grades and or test scores, prior discipline, prior attendance, sometimes an interview and sometimes a counselor recommendation. But by being ranked in descending order on this application score, there becomes a de facto cutoff in the process based on the capacity limits of the school. And it's that cutoff where we can identify the causal impact of being admitted and getting into one of those schools, or attending one of those schools. There, the treatment is this whole school model of attending a regional vocational technical school. I've sort of laid out what that includes, though we measure it imperfectly, though the counterfactual we can see for students where they enroll in the administrative data and they kind of enroll in the typical comprehensive high school, their residentially assigned school. For the comparison group, and in that paper, I find positive impacts on high school graduation, no difference in test scores. So that just say neither positive nor negative impacts there, but there is an increase in persistence through high school, so less early dropout, higher probability of earning an industry recognized credential, and that the impacts were larger for students who were eligible for subsidized meals. Yeah, I think that's as much as I want to say there. In the Hemelt, Leonard, and Paplow paper, they're studying an oversubscribed career academy in Wake County, North Carolina. This particular career academy has a focus on information technology. And the counterfactual setting here, interestingly, is being in the residentially assigned high school at the same location as the career academy. So the career academy is actually embedded in the overall comprehensive high school. And so the sort of treatment control contrast here looks a little different, in part because it's a whole school model, but there's not a explicit separation, wholesale and explicit separation of peers in the way that would occur if students were attending different schools in different locations. Regardless, they find positive impacts on high school graduation, unclear, sort of noisy and close to zero impacts on initial college going and earnings right after high school. But they are some of the first to show improvements on attendance in 9th grade as a potential mechanism for improved graduation, as well as higher test scores for students who are admitted to the career academy. In this, the Bonilla 2020 paper, I mentioned the competitive grant funding. This also uses a regression discontinuity design because districts applied for the competitive grant and then were scored on their grant application and then funded in descending order, again, with higher scoring schools getting more likely to get funding. And so then she looks just at the cutoff for where the funding was awarded or not awarded, and so she can compare districts but all the districts were similar in that they wanted the funding, right? And so we've sort of solved some of the selection problem because we know that these were districts that were interested in adding CTE offerings, and so then she can compare she compares the districts that got the funding to those that didn't, and finds a couple of things. One, that the money was spent on expanding CTE funding, and that there was a decrease in high school dropout. But in contrast to the Kemple and Willner paper that showed positive impacts just for boys, in the Bonilla paper, Surde shows that the effects are the reductions in dropout are larger for girls, and I think perhaps Also importantly, is that the program expansion as a result of getting these funds, which were meant to be aligned with local workforce needs, was largely in health service industries, which tend to be female dominated. And so then some of the gender differences in the composition of the workforce, as well as the composition of the CTE programs, might help explain some of the contrasting findings with the earlier work. And my 2021 paper with Eric and Steve that I'll highlight in just a second. But first, this Silliman and Vertanen paper that looks at admission to vocational schools in Finland, like the Massachusetts work, uses a regression discontinuity design. Students are competitively admitted to these schools in descending order on an application score, and they can look up to 15 years after school completion and find large positive impacts on earnings after completing their secondary education. And I think importantly, show that the earnings premia are large enough in those first 15 years to offset any concerns that the earnings premia later in life might be lower. So something I glossed over before, but in the Haniashek et al. Paper that looks at the sort of like lifelong impact of being in a CTE program in high school, their findings suggest that there are short-term payoffs, but that over the medium to long-term, students who are in the CTE program of study earn less later in life, and so the sort of net benefit is negative for those students, in part because of sort of the classical economic concerns that I mentioned yesterday, that specific skills can become outdated, and that in the absence of robust general skills, the ability to transition between jobs and or industries might be impeded. And so to some extent, though it uses a different research design and is in just one country, the Silliman and Vertanen paper are able to suggest that you know, those lifelong cost benefits might be less of a concern in the Finnish case. And then in our 2021 NBER working paper, we studied the oversubscribed schools in Connecticut. The benefit of the Connecticut context relative to the Massachusetts context is that the Connecticut Technical High School system is a system of 16, it's an all high school district. And what that means, well, they've got a centralized admissions process so that we can look at all schools simultaneously and get centralized admissions data. Whereas in Massachusetts, each of the technical high schools operate as their own school district. And so getting data for those schools has been more difficult because it requires brokering relationships with a series of individual schools and getting their application and admissions data. In any case, the process intuitively follows in the same way. Students are admitted in descending order on a set of criteria used to score their applications, and we can estimate the impacts of students who just barely got in because of being above the admissions threshold to those who just barely missed getting in because they were below the admissions threshold, and see what the effect is of getting in and or attending those schools. In this instance, I think you should think of the treatment as a whole school model that, like in Massachusetts, includes the ability to explore multiple possible programs of study in 9th grade to then make an informed choice about what is your highest preference, and then get matched with that choice by the school, and then have a multi-year cohort of students and teachers that define both your CTE and non-CTE course experiences. And then in Connecticut, the counterfactual is attending a comprehensive high school that on average has substantially fewer CTE program offerings, similar to Massachusetts. You can think about part of the contrast as like, 14 programs in a CTE dedicated school with maybe 4 programs at a comprehensive high school, though in our Connecticut paper, we show that the positive effects that we find on high school graduation earnings and test scores can't fully be explained just by differences in program offerings, suggesting that there are other dimensions of this experience of this whole school model that likely contribute to these positive outcomes. And so right now we can see earnings and employment by age 23, and we see like 30% higher earnings by age 23, so quite large. We see sort of what looks like a small negative effect on initial college enrollment right after high school completion, but no difference in college enrollment by age 23. So it suggests that students who get into these technical high schools are not substantially different in their likelihood of pursuing post-secondary education, though on average, the pursuit of post-secondary education is fairly low, but there's not a big difference between the sort of treated and counterfactual students. It's worth noting that the effects are only for males, and that these technical high schools in Connecticut predominantly offer sort of traditional trades and construction programs of study that boys are vastly overrepresented in. In contrast, we see that girls are much more likely to be in cosmetology, health services, and other human service professions. We're in the process of getting the actual course taking data to better understand these effects. Oh, sorry, I'm missing something in the chat here, I realize. Great, Kat, you asked. Okay, you asked just the right question though about could some of the differences be in the earnings effects be explained by differences of sorting into programs based on pay. Almost certainly some of the differences could be explained by the sort of disproportionate enrollment, let's say in early childhood education and care, which is a notoriously terribly compensated industry, even if we account for the possibility that people are indirectly compensated by maybe having subsidized childcare for their own children. But we're in the process of kind of understanding to what extent getting into these technical high schools can inform the industry-specific sorting and the sort of gendered patterns of that. And then also by getting the course-taking data, eventually, we should be able to see if there are also big differences in the sort of number and sequence of courses that students take, even among those who are admitted to the school. All right, I'm mindful of time. Just to show you a picture, because there will be some, I think, more reading to do. I just want to show you that the sort of on the horizontal axis in these figures are the sort of recentered application score. So you can think the highest scoring applicants to the school are furthest to the right, and the lowest scoring are to the left, and the zero with the dashed red line shows you the cutoff used for admission. So everybody above that line should have been above the threshold for admission, and everybody below should have been below the threshold for admission, or everybody to the left. And then on the vertical axis is the probability that a student actually enrolled in one of the technical high schools. And what you can see, and it is crucial for the regression discontinuity design, is this large jump in the probability of attending one of these schools. That's purely a function of being just above the initial admissions threshold. And it's that sort of jump that's induced by the capacity constraint and the fact that students were sort of ranked in descending order when they were admitted that allows us to identify the causal effect in these regression discontinuity designs. You'll also notice that some of the people to the left have non-zero probabilities of enrolling, and this is because also many of the people above the threshold have less than perfect probabilities of enrolling. This is because students got the offer of admission, but if they didn't take it up, then the slots were backfilled by people who came off of wait lists. And so those non-zero probabilities to the left of the cutoff reflect people who were eventually admitted and came off of a wait list, and the less than 100% probabilities to the right reflect people who got offers of admission but who chose not to enroll. But the sort of effect on enrolling was similar between men and women, but the effect on outcomes was quite different. This is a part of an excerpt from an infographic about our Connecticut study that's on the CTERN website I more or less have unpacked all of this here, but I'll just point out that the figure that's on this slide, is set up conceptually in ways that are similar to the figure that I just had up, except now on the vertical axis is not the probability of getting into or enrolling in the school, but it are the outcomes. And so you can see sort of the size of the effect among students above the red dashed line getting in, the impact on high school graduation outcomes. And that's one thing that's quite nice about regression discontinuity designs is if there is a convincing and large enough effect, you can see it in addition to demonstrate it with the regression models. And so here, so this was, a stylized example, and here it is in the live data where we can see that for men, the effect of being admitted had this large positive effect of like 5 percentage points on graduating from high school, and then the log of quarterly earnings, these massive positive effects on earnings. These are just 2 examples of the outcomes as we've laid them out. But for a policy relevance standpoint, the average high school graduation rate in the state of Connecticut is something around, I think, like 85% at this time. And so you can look to the left of the threshold on the left side of the panel and see that we've taken students who were, non-trivially below the average, state average probability of graduating from high school, and they've jumped up to above the state average here. Okay. So I think we're closing in on the home stretch. I'll just pause here to see if there are any questions about methodology or findings from these studies. I know this is a lot in a short period of time, but hopefully there's enough for you to then be able to pick and choose where you might like to go back and look again. And in the labs that we'll do over the next few days, the regression discontinuity design is going to be one that we highlight, in part because even outside of CTE, there are lots of practical applications of cutoffs in social science research and education specifically. If we're going to have an advancement program, we might advance students that were all at or above some cutoff. Or if we have a remediation program, we might expose students to a remediation based on the fact that they're at or below some sort of cutoff. And so there'll be sort of broader usefulness of these designs if you're not currently familiar, or if you haven't actually, if you've taken a course but not used them, there'll be opportunities to do the hands-on labs. So hopefully that will be useful. I know there's a lot of variation in people's methodological training, but trying to aim for the modal audience member at the moment. Okay, so opportunities for future research. There have been rapid changes in CTE offerings, the adding of new programs, the sort of new CTE or 21st century CTE programs that I mentioned yesterday. There's not been a lot of evaluation so far of what happens when you add these programs, and that could be an opportunity for additional, for new research. It's not clear necessarily with the expanded interest in CTE that there's been a sort of concurrent vigilance around whether or not there could be tracking. So I mentioned in Nat Malkus's piece for AEI, he raised concerns that there could be sort of a tale of 2 CTEs, where we might find that there's not differential participation, but differences in the type of participation. There could be some opportunities for additional study there around equity and tracking avoidance. There's more work to do about who participates in what program of study, and or trying to change the composition, possibly randomizing information or other interventions to change or impact who's participating in what programs of study. There are most certainly oversubscription of other popular programs in schools. I forget if you read for this year the evaluability study that the network conducted and highlighted some opportunities based on people who had kind of volunteered their information to sort of be evaluated to see whether or not they would be good candidates for a CTE evaluation, but like I discovered the opportunity to do this in Massachusetts and Connecticut, just by knowing your own context, there are almost certainly opportunities to do something similar across the country. And then just generally being attentive to opportunities for policy changes or other natural experiments, changes in the way things are funded, changes in the passing of bonds to build new CTE schools, things of that nature could create some really nice opportunities for causal impact evaluations. I just mentioned this from yesterday, but thinking about shifts in the composition of what programs are offered, who participates, where those programs are offered, could be a nice opportunity. Also here in Massachusetts, I showed you this yesterday, where there are changes in a dramatic increase in the share of schools offering IT programs. This is something that we plan to look at in Massachusetts, but certainly could be looked at with other programs elsewhere around the country. But I think as this work unfurls, in addition to capitalizing on these natural experiments, which will expand the pool of causal research, one thing that I certainly hope and that I think as a network we would hope will be included is closer attention to defining both the treated conditions as well as the counterfactual conditions. Specifically, when we think about CTE exposure, what are we measuring, and to what extent is this occurring? Where is the CTE experience happening? What components are included in those experiences? What outcomes are we using, and are there sort of differences in outcomes, heterogeneity in outcomes or impacts that could inform questions that are critical to understanding educational equity? So with that in mind, there are a number of studies that are ongoing. So the work that I mentioned yesterday in New York City, where we're using some naturally occurring experiments in the sort of school admissions process in high school to understand the impact of getting into or participating in CTE programs, getting closer to defining some CTE and counterfactual contrasts, so that when we estimate overall impacts, we know what we're estimating the impact of, but also trying to get into understanding some of the implementation and the details of what students experience, so we have a better handle on kind of whether or why we think there should or shouldn't be an effect. There's the ongoing MDRC evaluation of the PTech schools, in particular the first school in New York City. Beth Glennie is doing a study of industry certifications based on policy rollout in Florida. EDC, Kathy Shields, is doing some work in Northern California on career academies. A new network member doing dual enrollment in North Carolina work, where the dual enrollment opportunities are focused on CTE. I'm part of a research team using national data to look at CTE and students with disabilities in applied STEM. But Michael Gottfried and Daniel Classic are also looking at free and reduced price lunch eligible students in that national data. And Rachel Rosen and MDRC recently received a new IES award to look at career advising programs through I think a large scale RCT. So that some of these are further along. Some of these will be 5 years probably before we know much, but you can get a sense by looking at the structured abstracts through the IES website if you're interested in what exactly they'll be studying, what outcomes they intend to use, and on what timeline you might expect updates to that work. So just highlight a few research structures where to look for this research. So you know about the Research Network. That's the first link. The CTE Policy Exchange, that's a multi-state research lab facilitated through Georgia State. That link's up there. The MDRC Center for Effective CTE is a great resource. ACTER, national research organization connected or dedicated to CTE research, with annual conferences late in the year. The Center for Vocational Education and Research, facilitated through the London School of Economics, focused largely on CTE in the UK. Though not exclusively, and then the Swiss leading house based in Zurich, doing work on a lot of the dual models in Central Europe. So plenty of resources and places to go see who is doing what. One of the silver linings of the global pandemic from a research standpoint has been that the CEVR seminars have gone online, and so there are some opportunities to hear cutting edge research being presented without having to incur the cost of flying to London on a monthly basis, which I presume is not in the cards for most of our budgets, mine included. Okay, so with that, I think we're short of time by a few minutes, which is just fine. I think it just means we have some time for additional questions or unpacking of things that I otherwise maybe took in quick strides.
So it seems like there's not much post-secondary CTE research out there. Do you think that's because it's really hard to find that cutoff to run good causal research in the post-secondary setting?
So I do think that that's part of it, and I do think probably some of it I should just own as like I probably needed at least one more slide in here based on the work that's come out in the last 18 months. So Riley Acton's work that I mentioned about how students dynamically change what programs they enroll in community colleges in response to changes in local labor market conditions. I also, don't have on here Celeste Carruthers and Chris Jepson have some work on the returns to the Tennessee Colleges of Applied Technology. In part, some of the higher ed research applies to adult and non-traditional college students, because McCall, Kurlander, and Stevens and Michelle Gross have some work in California where they look at this too. Dijou at UC Irvine has also done some nice work on returns to community college certificates. But some of these are the causal identification is less strong in some instances based on the research design, not in all. I mean, some of it is it's a little more out of my wheelhouse, and some of it also is that we find that participating in these certificate programs and earning the certificate shows clear positive return on investment. So I do think that that's coming through pretty clearly across a number of studies and contexts. And so I will put on my calendar to share via Jill and the actually I think I might have the email list, but I will put together a slide and share it with you all that will be potentially non-exhaustive, but will hit the highlights in ways that I probably should have incorporated for today. Thanks for raising that, Gresham.
So I had a question about like implementation fidelity and like quality of experiences. Like, how does that play into this? Because I imagine students could have an incredible teacher who has decades of experience, with a specific domain, and a new teacher who has no experience who went through an alt cert program. So like, where does like quality and implementation fidelity play into this?
Great question. So I think the short answer, Megan, is that like we don't have great measures of that in most instances, and so we're sort of like waving our hands in these whole school models where the effects are really large, and saying we're going to try to knock down some possible explanations for the cause, but not get at all of the components, right? So some of it is like the opportunity for causal identification has given us this really like blunt measure, and now we need to try to unpack it, retrospectively or prospectively with some other research. And then the other is, because we're doing this retrospectively, there aren't solid measures of implementation fidelity, because it's not been like something that's been implemented prospectively that we could follow the implementation of. That said, I do have a paper that's under review, and we have a report version of it that's available through the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education's website. where we look at the relationship between the sort of, so in Massachusetts, all CTE teachers, regardless of whether they have sort of a traditional teaching license or an occupational license that's been granted to them based on, you know, a kind of more discrete set of educational training, but then multiple years of professional experience in their technical area, we do see that all of those teachers still have to take and pass an assessment in their you know, kind of substantive domain that the state has created these tests, and there's sort of a paper component and a practical component. Anyway, the upshot of this research is we find that teachers that scored better on those assessments tend to have students that earn more money in the sort of 7 to 10 years after completing high school, right? So we do see some connection between, to the extent that these assessments measure teaching quality or substantive knowledge, right? A positive association between the substantive knowledge of the teacher and the sort of employment and earnings information of the students after high school. But I realize those are two different things, but that's the extent to which that I know of we've been able to attend to those sorts of dimensions so far. But an implementation study would and you know, fidelity study would be really, I think, important and useful for this work.
So I have a quick question. When you were talking about measurement issues, you know, when you think about the rougher measures of counting courses or something like that, how have you seen any difference in the way, or how much difference does it make when you think about local differences? So one of the things that I encounter here, so we work with 11 districts, and there are districts that actually have the same program with the same, so within the cluster, they have the same program of study, but the number of courses required to complete that program of study changes. So then in terms of measurement, it becomes a lot less precise, right? So if I say, oh, you know, completer, so did you complete the whole thing? It's actually, I could actually be talking about a completely different number of courses. So I was wondering, have you guys seen any, in your experience, is this something that I should be very concerned about? Is this something that could force me to just think about courses? I love to hear your thoughts.
Sure. So definitely, I think it's the sort of thing that we should think about. You'd want to account for, right, with a finer grained measure. So in this instance, rather than use like a concentrator or completer, I think looking at people in the same substantive domain, you'd want to see, you know, what's the difference between taking 3 courses or 2 courses in a health science program of study, right? It could be actually a quite nice opportunity to learn. The way I've dealt with it in my more observational research is to include like a fixed effect for school, so that the comparisons I'm making are just between students in the same school, so that any sort of, I mean, in this instance, you're observing important differences between schools in the structure of their program. But you know, then you could see whether or not there are differences in the impacts or the associations between, you know, being in that concentration in that school compared to being in that concentration in another school. But definitely, I think that's a great example where you have the contextual details that help you understand at the outset, right, important differences in the structure of the program that could certainly explain differences in anticipated outcomes.
Yeah, and I should mention, by the way, that we wouldn't have known this. I mean, we use state data from a research data center. We wouldn't have known this if we hadn't done a census of our district partners' course offerings, which took us a very long time to even obtain the information. Like, it was like pulling teeth to get them to share a lot of this stuff with us. And we wouldn't have known if we hadn't done this. So like if you go to the data center and just work with the data, this is something that you probably would have missed.
Definitely, and I think these are this is part of the richness of this detailed data, but also emphasizes the importance of the sort of like the shoe leather and the on the ground connection to the actual practice and implementation, so that you understand the relevant moving parts, so that we could really unpack again, this contrast between what students that we're calling are treated and how that compares to the folks that we're considering in the control or comparison group, and all of the different dimensions of those experiences that are included on the treatment side. Yeah, absolutely. You're welcome. All right, now I think I've overstayed my welcome by a few minutes. I will stop sharing my screen and see the whole complement of faces. Oh, there's Jill. That was the main face I was looking for to make sure that I wasn't going to sign off and leave you without further direction. So thanks again all very much for this engagement this morning. This has been great and very much appreciated by me. I hope this has been useful for you. Feel free to follow up with questions, and I will commit to sending you a slide with some of the aggregation of this post-secondary studies that I did not make it into the deck before the week's end.
Great. I'm sure I'm speaking for everyone. Thank you so much, Shaun.